Battle Baptism, Château-Thierry, and the Belleau Wood, summer 1918. American troops first experienced the true brutality of World War I in June 1918, when the German offensive rolled to the Marne River. Units of the newly arrived American Expeditionary Forces rushed to the aid of the exhausted French to stop the enemy's breakthrough on the approaches to Paris. The battle near the town of Château-Thierry was a baptism of fire for many Americans. On May 31st, the Germans reached the Marne, attempting to force the river, but they were met by machine guns from the 7th Machine Gun Battalion of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division, which had taken up defensive positions alongside French units. While the French blew up the bridge, American machine gunners fired on the German columns, holding them back even after they were cut off on the enemy bank. These young men from Ohio and New York, who a few months earlier had no idea what life in the trenches was like, suddenly found themselves in the midst of chaos, frenzied explosions, panicked civilians, and advancing German bayonets. But they held their ground. The fire of the American Yankees, as they were jokingly called by their allies, forced the enemy to retreat. The fire of the American Yankees, as they were jokingly called by their allies, forced the enemy to retreat. For their courage in holding back the enemy, the 3rd Division was nicknamed Rock of Marne, because its soldiers became an unshakable rock against which the German wave broke. However, the danger was not yet over. The German troops, repelled from the Marne, turned west and entrenched themselves in the dense Belleau Wood nearby. It was there, in Belleau Wood, that the Americans gained fame, paying it for a terrible price. The 2nd Infantry Division of the United States, which included a Marine brigade, entered the battle. The French command, aware of the freshness but also the inexperience of the Americans, initially advised them to retreat and dig in behind the lines. To this, Marine Captain Lloyd Williams simply uttered the famous phrase, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." The Marines decided to stand their ground. They quickly dug trenches with their bayonets in the middle of a wheat field in front of the forest. When the German infantry attacked through the golden ears of corn on June 3rd, the Americans lay down and let the enemy get within 100 yards, then opened furious rifle fire. As every Marine is a deadly weapon when he has his rifle, General Pershing would later say. The German chains were literally mown down by bullets, the attack faltered, and the wounded Germans retreated back into the thickets of Belleau. The next 3 weeks turned the quiet forest into a veritable hell. On June 6, 1918, the Americans launched an offensive to drive the enemy out of the Belleau Wood. The Marine Corps' attack on Belleau became a legendary and at the same time horrific page in U.S. history. Before the attack, veteran Marine Sergeant Dan Daly, twice recipient of the Medal of Honor, walked along the line of his soldiers and shouted, "Come on, boys, do you want to live forever?" To the frenzied battle cry of "Hurrah!" several waves of American infantry rose from the trenches and moved across the wheat field toward the forest. The Germans met them with a barrage of machine gun and artillery fire. Soldiers fell by the dozens, mown down by bursts of Maxim fire, but they kept advancing. Major Burton Sibley, commander of the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marine Regiment, broke into the south part of the forest where a bloody hand-to-hand battle ensued with bayonets, rifle butts, and knives. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marine Regiment, commanded by Major Benjamin Barry, stormed the western edge of the forest. They ran through tall wheat under heavy machine gun fire, overcoming wire barriers and choking on gunpowder smoke. On the first day of the assault on Belleau Wood, the Americans suffered more casualties than ever before in the history of the Marine Corps. More than 1,000 soldiers and 31 officers were killed or wounded. But despite these terrible figures, the Marines captured the first lines of German trenches and dug in firmly around the forest. At night, the wounded cried out for help among the broken trees and craters, machine guns occasionally combing the darkness, but reinforcements arrived and the Americans dug in the conquered sector. As soon as the U.S. took control of part of the forest, the Germans threw all their forces into driving them out. Counterattacks followed one after another. During one of them, 12 German soldiers crept up to the positions of the 5th Marine Regiment, but there they were met by the burly Staff Sergeant Ernest Jackson. He grabbed his bayonet knife and rushed forward, stabbing 2 attackers and forcing the rest to retreat, saving his comrades from a surprise attack. For this feat, Jackson, who served under the pseudonym Charles Hoffman, became the first Marine to be awarded the Medal of Honor in World War I. There were many similar feats in the Belleau Wood. For example, telephone operator Henry Hulbert pulled communication wires forward under heavy fire, for which he received the Distinguished Service Cross. Small groups of Americans and Germans wandered through the thickets, bumping into each other, and then grenades, bayonets, and even bare fists came into play. The forest thicket turned into chaos with fallen trees, barbed wire, and mutilated bodies. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the Americans persistently pressed the enemy. Only on June 26th, after 3 weeks of continuous horror, did the Belleau Wood finally come under complete Allied control. Exhausted, soot-covered Marines emerged victorious from the battle. This battle cost the Americans nearly 10,000 men, including 1,800 killed. The French, impressed by the resilience of the American Devils, officially renamed the battle site Marine Corps Forest in honor of the feat of the 4th USMC Brigade. 9 Marines and even 1 military doctor were awarded the Medal of Honor for their heroism in these battles. The battles at Château-Thierry and in the Belleau Wood became symbols of the new spirit that the Americans brought to the front. Until recently, the enemy had contemptuously called them inexperienced boys, but now they were convinced that they were a stubborn and daring enemy. A German report noted that American soldiers act energetically, confidently, and are extremely accurate marksmen. The Allied press trumpeted the arrival of a new force. The French joked that the Yankees had the mad courage of newcomers. After the victory in the Belleau Wood, General John Pershing proudly declared, "The deadliest weapon in the world is a U.S. Marine with his rifle." This bold confidence greatly inspired the exhausted Allies. French officers breathed a sigh of relief. Now they saw that the newly arrived American divisions really knew how to fight. A British soldier recalled how they stood along the road at Marne and watched the fresh, strong, smooth-cheeked American battalions marching by, waving their arms and smiling, shouting something to us. The British smiled back, although they thought to themselves, "Do these young men know what they're getting themselves into? Will they be able to do it?" But the very fact of their appearance encouraged the Allies. One British officer said, "At that time, we were on the brink. The experienced veterans were nervously exhausted, and the new recruits were too young and green. If those hundreds of thousands of fresh, strong, well-equipped, and enthusiastic young men hadn't come, the war could have reached a stalemate or ended in a truce. But the Americans came. Just imagine what the Germans must have thought about that." The German command did indeed note with concern that since July 1918, the balance of power on the Western Front had shifted in favor of the Entente, thanks to the constant arrival of American reinforcements. First independent operation, the offensive at Saint-Mihiel, 1918. After their successes in the summer of 1918, American troops sought to prove that they were capable not only of defending themselves, but also of launching a decisive offensive. Such an opportunity presented itself in September. At the junction of the French and American fronts, a German salient, known as the Saint-Mihiel salient, had been deeply embedded in the Allied positions since the beginning of the war. The Germans had held this territory since 1914, threatening the approaches to the city of Verdun. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, considered it an honor to entrust his young divisions with the task of eliminating this salient and liberating French territory. Marshal Foch initially hesitated to give the Americans a separate operation, but eventually agreed. For the first time in the history of this war, entire American armies were formed to operate under their own flag. On September 12, 1918, at around 1 a.m., the sky above Saint-Mihiel was lit up by thousands of flashes as more than 3,000 Allied guns opened devastating fire on German positions. The earth shook from the explosions of shells of various calibers, mixing wires, trenches, and enemy pillboxes. Due to the diversionary cunning, the artillery preparation was short, only 4 hours, while the Germans expected the shelling to last much longer. At 5:30 a.m., the guns fell silent, and dark waves of American infantry rose from the trenches across the front. The offensive at Saint-Mihiel became a triumphant march attack by the American Army. The 1st U.S. Army was supported by 2 French divisions, but the main blow was delivered by the Americans, a total of more than 500,000 soldiers, grouped into 3 American corps. The 1st, 4th, 26th, and 42nd Divisions advanced on the flanks, breaking through the salient on both sides, while 7 more divisions stood in the center and in reserve. Pershing made sure that the troops did not advance alone. For the first time, the Americans used tanks and aircraft in mass to support the infantry. A young, talented officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, led the tank brigade, having at his disposal 144 light French Renault FT tanks, freshly trained by American crews. Another 275 tanks were provided by the French, bringing the total number of combat vehicles in the offensive to about 419. Patton distributed them so that at least a few tank platoons supported each infantry brigade. 2 companies of tanks advanced in combat formation with the infantry at the very beginning of the attack, while the 3rd was kept in reserve. At the same time, an unprecedented number of aircraft took to the sky, about 1,500 Allied aircraft of various types. It was the largest air armada of the entire war. American General William Mitchell organized air support from 28 squadrons of the U.S. Air Force, as well as French, British, and even Italian units. Squadrons of Spad fighters circled in the sky, covering Breguet and de Havilland DH-4, or Liberty, bombers that carried death to the enemy's rear. This was supposed to overwhelm the Germans. And it did. After an artillery strike and a surprise attack from 2 directions, the German defense line faltered. German units, exhausted by 4 years of war, were taken by surprise by the speed and pressure of the Americans. Many German units were just about to retreat from the salient on orders from their command when they were hit by a barrage of fire and steel. Living out their last days in this salient, the Germans had limited forces, 8 divisions on a wide front, and were not prepared for a massive defense. Where resistance was strongest, Pershing sent in tanks. Renault Caterpillars crushed barbed wire, crossed craters, and broke into enemy trenches, causing panic with their appearance. American infantry followed the tanks, attacking scattered pockets of resistance. By noon on September 12th, the troops of the U.S. First Corps from the south had completed the maximum program for the first day, capturing key villages and the first line of trenches. On the western flank of the salient, units of the Fourth Corps also advanced rapidly. The German defense had virtually collapsed. At the end of the first day of the offensive, Pershing, seeing unexpectedly great success, ordered the operation to be accelerated. On the morning of September 13th, the advanced units of the 1st Division, advancing from the east, joined forces near the town of Vigneulles with the soldiers of the 26th Division, who were breaking through from the west. The Saint-Mihiel salient was caught in a pincer movement. Thousands of German soldiers were surrounded and had no choice but to surrender. In just 36 hours of fierce but rapid fighting, the Americans completely cleared the Saint-Mihiel salient. The front line was straightened out, eliminating the threatening pocket that had hung over the Allies for 4 years. The price of victory was surprisingly low compared to other battles of the Great War. About 7,000 casualties in 2 days, while the enemy lost 16,000 soldiers in captivity alone. The joy of the French knew no bounds. In the liberated villages, residents greeted American soldiers as guardian angels, treating them to wine and embracing them in the open air, despite their dirty, blood-stained uniforms. Soldiers of the 1st American Division raised the U.S. flag over the town of Saint-Mihiel. For the first time since the War of 1812, the American Army had victoriously raised its banner on European soil. General Pershing personally drove along the broken roads to the liberated zone to see the results of his first independent offensive with his own eyes. The scene was impressive. Endless columns of German prisoners, confused and shocked, stretched along the roads escorted by thin, soot-covered but proud American infantrymen. Hundreds of captured machine guns, cannons, and supply depots fell into the hands of the victors. At an airfield abandoned by the Germans, American pilots captured several fully operational German Fokker aircraft, which would now be used against their former owners. The success at Saint-Mihiel cemented the reputation of the American Army as a formidable fighting force. Newspapers in the U.S. wrote enthusiastically about Pershing's lightning strike. In Europe, the Allies noted the tactical ingenuity of the Americans, careful preparation of the operation, surprise, coordinated use of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aviation. All of this bore fruit. Even critically minded French generals had to admit that Pershing had passed his test. One of the factors of success was the personal courage of American commanders. Two officers who were constantly on the front lines with their soldiers were noted: Lieutenant Colonel George Patton and Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur. When tanks broke through alongside the infantry, many commanders preferred to direct the battle from the rear, but not Patton. He ran under fire in front of his Renaults, personally directing vehicles that had been knocked off course and encouraging the infantry, which had become disoriented under fire. On September 26th, already during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Patton was seriously wounded by a bullet, but even lying on a stretcher, he continued to give orders, for which he received the Distinguished Service Cross. MacArthur, commander of the 42nd Rainbow Division, also became famous for his audacity. He generally disregarded danger, sometimes going into battle without a helmet or weapons, only with a whip, demonstrating his personal calm under fire to his soldiers. This style inspired his subordinates to overcome the chaos of battle. Military historians noted that after Saint-Mihiel, the Americans developed a dangerous confidence in their invincibility. Fresh troops, quick success, it seemed that the enemy was about to fall. Unfortunately, the bloodiest test lay ahead, one that would reveal the true price of victory. After clearing the salient, Pershing did not push his troops forward toward the city of Metz, even though the road there was open. At the request of the Allied command, American divisions were urgently transferred further north to the vast forests of Argonne. A general offensive of all Entente forces across the entire front was being prepared, the so-called 100 Days Offensive, which was supposed to finally break Germany. The American Army was assigned a section of the front between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, an extremely difficult section for an offensive. Some of the best German units and several lines of defense built over many years were stationed there. The hasty transfer of 15 American divisions from under Saint-Mihiel to new positions created a huge logistical problem. In 2 weeks, 600,000 soldiers, 4,000 guns, 90,000 horses, and nearly 1,000,000 tons of supplies had to be secretly transported 60 miles. This transport of forces was the largest transport operation in the history of the U.S. Army at that time. Young Colonel George Marshall planned it down to the smallest detail. The troops marched at night. Each division was allocated a time corridor on narrow roads, and places for daytime stops and routes for artillery, infantry, trucks, and tanks were determined separately. Despite this, the 3 dirt roads and 3 narrow railway branches could not cope with the flow. Columns of infantry, 2-kilometer-long convoys of horse-drawn wagons, hundreds of trucks, and heavy artillery on tractors all mixed together on the road. Each moved at different speeds, causing traffic jams. The rains washed away the soil, the vehicles got stuck in the mud, the trucks broke down on the potholes, overturning and spilling shells into the ditch. American, French, and even Indo-Chinese drivers who were involved in the motorcades argued and almost fought for the right-of-way. Witnesses recalled that sometimes they had to wait several hours for the next traffic jam of broken carts and stuck tanks to be cleared. But in the end, exhausted by night marches, the American divisions took up their positions. Ahead of them loomed the dark wall of the Argonne Forest, the very same forest where in 1792 the French Revolutionary Army had stopped the Prussian advance, and where the Germans were now preparing to fight the Americans. A bloody breakthrough, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, September through November 1918. On September 26, 1918, the American Army launched its largest offensive of the war, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. At 5:30 a.m., thousands of guns opened fire on German positions in the fog. The roar of the cannonade merged into a continuous rumble for tens of kilometers. Within a few hours, the advance units of the 1st U.S. Army rushed forward under the cover of the morning fog. On the first day, everything went according to plan. The infantry advanced behind a wall of fire, line of artillery fire, and in some places penetrated 3 to 5 kilometers. The Germans, weakened by previous battles, initially put up little resistance and retreated. It seemed that this offensive would be as successful as the Saint-Mihiel Offensive. However, after initial successes, difficulties began. The Argonne Forest and the hilly terrain to the east of it were ideal for defense. When the morning fog cleared, the Americans encountered well-aimed German machine gun nests, hidden in ravines, pillboxes, and forest edges. Precise artillery fire rained down on the infantry from the heights on the flanks. Those units that had advanced too far were caught in crossfire and forced to lie down. The difficulty was compounded by the fact that many of the American divisions thrown into the breach were green and inexperienced in combat. For example, the 79th Division encountered strong resistance in the village of Malancourt, but instead of bypassing it, it launched a frontal attack and lost hundreds of soldiers. Casualties grew by the hour. The Germans took full revenge for Saint-Mihiel. Their artillery mowed down the American ranks, causing about 75% of all Allied casualties in this battle. There were so many wounded that the medical stations in the rear were overwhelmed with work. Doctors operated non-stop, and the wounded lay in the open air awaiting evacuation. On the second day of the offensive, the Americans encountered a key target, the fortified Montfort Hill. This hill, crowned with the ruins of an ancient tower, served as the Germans' main observation and defense center. On Pershing's orders, Montforton was to be taken on the first day by the 79th and 37th Divisions, but they were overwhelmed by machine gun fire. Now reserves joined the assault, the 4th U.S. Division together with French tanks. A fierce battle ensued for every yard of the slope. Splinters and stones flew in all directions from grenade explosions. Soldiers crawled through ravines, threw grenades at concrete pillboxes, and were blown up by mines. The Germans put up fierce resistance, but under pressure they were forced to retreat. On September 27th, at dawn on the third day of the operation, American infantrymen raised the Star-Spangled Banner over the heights of Montfaucon. Below, abandoned German warehouses and twisted guns were visible. Another stronghold of the Hindenburg Line had fallen, but at a high price. Despite local successes, the overall pace of the offensive slowed. By October 1st, the Americans had advanced a maximum of 10 to 12 kilometers, failing to meet the ambitious goals of the first day. The losses in the first week alone were enormous, about 26,000 killed and wounded. General Pershing realized that it was impossible to continue in the same vein. He ordered the operation to be suspended and the units to be reorganized. Several generals who had failed to prove themselves were removed from their posts, including the commander of the 5th Corps, who had attacked Montfaucon too directly. Experienced divisions were brought to the front. Instead of the exhausted 37th, 79th, and 35th Divisions, the Old Guard was brought in, the 1st, 32nd, and 3rd Divisions respectively. Pershing even transferred the command of the First Army to General Hunter Liggett, recognizing that the operation needed a fresh perspective. Pershing himself, as commander-in-chief, now focused on coordinating the two American armies. A second army was also formed under the command of General Bullard. On October 4th, the offensive resumed, the so-called second phase of the battle. The Germans were not idle either. They brought in reserves, and now 31 German divisions stood against two American armies. Battles raged for every grove, every ravine. The Americans threw their last reserves into the breach. The 42nd Rainbow Division, in which General MacArthur served, distinguished itself. On October 14th to 16th, its brigades stormed the Château-Thierry Heights, a key position in the German second line of defense. After 3 days of maneuvering, they managed to find a weak spot and, after a flanking maneuver, drive the enemy out of Châtillon. MacArthur personally went on reconnaissance of the enemy lines and was the first to storm the captured hill, for which he received his 3rd wound and his 2nd Distinguished Service Cross. The capture of the Châtillon Heights was a turning point in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The German front finally faltered and began to retreat. Against the backdrop of these efforts, legends arose about the personal heroism of ordinary Americans. On October 8, 1918, a corporal from the countryside performed a feat that became a symbol of the bravery of the doughboys, the nickname for American infantrymen. Alvin York, a hunter from Tennessee, along with a dozen comrades, found himself on flank guard duty for a company that had advanced deep into the forest near the town of Cornay. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a German position. Machine guns opened fire, killing most of the Americans. York was almost the only one left unharmed, armed only with a rifle and a revolver. Under a hail of bullets, he single-handedly entered the fray. With accurate fire, York destroyed several German machine gunners, and when 10 Germans rushed at him in hand-to-hand combat, he shot them one by one with his .45 caliber revolver. The stunned German Oberleutnant offered to surrender. Returning to his lines, York brought in a whole string of 132 German prisoners. For this incredible battle, he was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Medal of Honor. York became a living legend, embodying the image of a modest farmer sniper who became the scourge of his enemies. Another drama unfolded on the opposite flank, in the impenetrable thickets of the Argonne forest. There, the so-called Lost Battalion became famous, a symbol of the resilience and self-sacrifice of soldiers. On October 2, 9 companies, about 540 men, from the 308th Regiment of the 77th Division, recruited from New York draftees, advanced too quickly into the forest and were cut off by the Germans. The group was commanded by Major Charles Whittlesey, a former New York lawyer who suddenly found himself in the role of a frontline commander. The Germans quickly surrounded the battalion in a narrow wooded ravine. A 6-day siege began. The Germans repeatedly offered the Americans to surrender. According to historians, they brought a note under a white flag demanding capitulation. Major Whittlesey only contemptuously rejected the offer. Then the enemy began to methodically destroy those surrounded, attacking in waves and firing mortars and heavy machine guns. The Americans ran out of food and water on the 2nd day. The soldiers roasted fern roots and divided their rations among 10 people. Many wounded soldiers died without medical assistance. In addition, American artillery did not know the exact location of the lost battalion and occasionally fired on them. The only means of communication were carrier pigeons. One after another, they flew away with capsules, but the Germans shot them down. Finally, the last pigeon, named Cher Ami, French for dear friend, received a short note. "We are on the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is firing on us. For God's sake, stop." Cher Ami flew under a hail of bullets and was wounded, but he reached headquarters and enemy fire was corrected. This saved the lives of those surrounded. On October 8, when less than 200 of the 550 surrounded soldiers remained in formation, their own forces finally broke through to them. Impressed by what they saw, even the German officers saluted the exhausted heroes. Major Whittlesey and several of his comrades received medals of honor, and the story of the lost battalion quickly became legendary in the press. Meanwhile, By the end of October 1918, American troops had accomplished their mission. As a result of 3 weeks of fighting, the 1st U.S. Army broke through all 3 enemy defensive lines and cleared the Argonne Forest of the enemy. To their left, French troops also advanced 20-30 kilometers. On November 1st, the Allies moved into the final 3rd stage of the offensive, a general breakthrough. The Americans again threw tanks, aircraft, and all their artillery forward to prevent the Germans from gaining a foothold on the new front lines. Explosions tore the earth to pieces. German bunkers, once impregnable, now flew into the air from direct hits by 6- and 8-inch howitzers. Observation balloons rose into the sky, correcting the fire. A young artillery captain, Harry Truman, the future President of the United States, commanded a battery of 75mm guns and covered the targets so accurately that his division received thanks from the infantry. German soldiers, driven to despair by continuous attacks, began to surrender en masse. In October 1918, Germany was visibly losing its will to fight. The German command noted a decline in morale. Soldiers were increasingly deserting their positions or surrendering in whole units. Many understood that with the arrival of endless reserves of Yankees and new technology, the war could not be won. Rebellions and riots were brewing deep in the rear. The German army began to collapse from within, and the front cracked under the blows of the Allies. In the final days before the armistice, the Americans managed to strike a final chord. On November 6, 1918, units of the 1st U.S. Army reached the outskirts of the ancient city of Sedan. It was near Sedan in 1870 that the French suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Germans. Now, history seemed to have taken its revenge. To avoid chaos, the French command asked Pershing to stop and allow the French to enter Sedan, for political reasons of prestige. He reluctantly agreed. So American units occupied the heights around the city, and French troops solemnly entered Sedan, cutting off the last important German supply railway. This effectively ended the fighting. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the last shots were fired and Germany signed an armistice. The Battle of Meuse-Argonne was the largest and bloodiest in the history of the American Army. It cost the United States more than 122,000 casualties, including 26,000 killed. But this sacrifice was in vain. The German front was broken, and the war was won. Logistical challenges of October 1918. Special mention should be made of the titanic efforts of the U.S. rear and engineering services, without which victory might have been delayed. After breaking through the first lines in Argonne, a problem arose: how to supply troops with fuel, ammunition, and food on the scorched, devastated land that remained on the other side of the German defenses. The infrastructure simply couldn't keep up with the pace of the offensive. The roads were terrible, broken by years of war, pitted with craters, littered with abandoned cannons. The Germans blew up or mined the railroad tracks during their retreat. In October 1918, supplying the American Army became a nightmare for its logisticians. In the early days of the offensive, supply convoys stood motionless for hours. Transport arteries were completely clogged. Trucks, guns, and wagons were stuck in the mud so badly that they had to be pulled out by entire teams, and horses collapsed from exhaustion. On one day, an artillery battery advanced only 2 kilometers in 8 hours. The rest of the time, its guns stood in traffic jams on a narrow, broken road, waiting for engineers to repair a destroyed bridge. Engineering units worked around the clock. They laid temporary gravel roads parallel to the destroyed highways, built bridges over ditches, and laid pontoons across small rivers. American engineers built about 40 kilometers of dirt and narrow-gauge roads and laid dozens of kilometers of telephone cable as the Army advanced. On the orders of General Liggett, commander of the First Army, the offensive was even temporarily suspended for several days at the end of October. A break was needed to bring up reinforcements, train new recruits, and, most importantly, allow sappers to build roads and restore rail connections. It was at this time that hundreds of new American Liberty trucks, the first true logistical workhorses of the U.S. Army, began arriving from the ports to the front lines. They transported tons of ammunition and food to places not yet reached by rail. Deep in the rear, the Americans built huge warehouses, veritable tent cities, where supplies freshly unloaded from steamships in French ports were brought. From there, everything moved to the front by rail and motor convoy, like a conveyor belt. No less important was the organization of medical evacuation and technical support. Thanks to the efforts of the rear services, the U.S. Army equipped hundreds of ambulance trucks, vehicles that transported the wounded from frontline dressing stations to hospitals. Ironically, these vehicles were also French, Ford or Peugeot, but with American volunteers at the wheel, often female nurses. They saved thousands of lives on the battlefield near Meuse-Argonne, racing along broken roads in the rain and under artillery fire. Meanwhile, mechanics in the rear repaired tanks and guns. The same Renault FT light tanks that began the offensive in a number of 144 were almost all gone by mid-October. Many burned down from direct hits, but even more simply broke down in the harsh conditions of the rough terrain. It rained cats and dogs in September, and mud got into the tank engines, putting dozens of them out of action. American repair units worked around the clock, trying to get at least a few dozen vehicles back into service. The supply services worked just as tirelessly to feed the Army. Bread was baked in mobile bakeries, and gasoline was poured into canisters at fuel depots for long road trips. It was a war of engines and stomachs, and the Americans, with their vast resources from their wealthy homeland, spared no fuel, canned food, or coffee for the soldiers on the front lines. All these titanic efforts paid off. By early November 1918, the American Army was able to ramp up its attack again. After resting and getting its rear up to speed, it hit the weakened enemy like a fist. The enemy could no longer hold its positions. It was physically and morally exhausted. The last days of the Meuse-Argonne offensive were a triumph of logistics. Every day, American units received tons of ammunition and provisions, allowing them to attack continuously without fear of exposing their rear. General Liggett was delighted. Now that new roads and narrow-gauge railways had been laid through the Argonne Forest, the American advantage in manpower and resources was finally working to its full potential. The Germans understood this too, and their morale finally collapsed. Later, researchers would call the autumn of 1918 a catastrophe of morale for Germany. Soldiers began to surrender en masse by the thousands, and entire units abandoned their trenches without a fight. Revolutionary uprisings broke out across the country. In such conditions, the German command had no choice. The war was effectively lost. On November 11th, Germany signed the surrender, without waiting for the invasion of its territory, which the Allies had planned for 1919. A new factor in warfare: American tanks, aircraft, and the big gun. In the final battles of World War I, the Americans made a significant contribution to the development of military technology and tactics. At the beginning of 1918, the U.S. had virtually no tanks or aircraft of its own, but in less than a year, the situation changed radically. General Pershing, inspired by the British experience during the Cambrai Breakthrough, 1917, succeeded in creating the American Tank Corps. Tank units trained in France alongside French instructors. By the fall of 1918, 2 American battalions of Renault FT light tanks were ready for combat under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Patton. These maneuverable little ones with 37mm cannons proved themselves well. On the battlefield, they cleared the way for the infantry through barbed wire and frightened German soldiers who were not used to close combat with tanks. In addition to light tanks, the Americans planned to use heavy tanks as well. Back in the spring of 1918, an American factory began licensed production of British Mark V tanks. Although they didn't make it to the front in time, several crews of the U.S. 301st Heavy Tank Battalion underwent training with the British and even took part in the final battles on the British front, for example in the defeat of the Germans at San Quentin in October 1918. In Meuse-Argonne itself, the Americans had to rely on French tanks. In addition to the light Renault tanks, they had several dozen Schneider CA-1 and Saint-Chamond medium tanks provided by France. These vehicles were temperamental and often broke down, but their heavy 75mm gun was a formidable weapon against pillboxes. By the end of October, most of the tank brigades were out of action, with losses and breakdowns reaching 80%. But even without tanks, the Americans continued to advance, proving that they could fight in an open warfare style, where maneuverability and accuracy were decisive, not just trenches. The Americans also joined the air war, which reached unprecedented proportions in 1918. Arriving in France with almost no aircraft, the U.S. quickly organized the supply of Allied aircraft and the production of its own. Cooperation with the French was particularly successful. American squadrons received the latest SPAD-13 and Breguet 14 two-seater bombers, and also developed their own version of the British DH-4 bomber with a Liberty engine, for which it was nicknamed the Liberty plane. By the autumn battles, the U.S. had deployed 45 squadrons that participated in both Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne. American pilots quickly gained experience. Eddie Rickenbacker, a former race car driver from Ohio, became the most successful U.S. ace in a few months, scoring 26 aerial victories and being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The Air Force supported the offensive not only with air battles. American planes bombed German headquarters and railways, and sometimes even dove on machine gun positions, strafing them from a low altitude. Pilots mastered a new tactic, assault squadrons, in which aircraft provided direct support to the infantry, strafing trenches and dropping small bombs. This was still in its infancy, but it provided important experience that would prove useful 20 years later. In the sky, the Allies gained complete dominance. In the last days before the armistice, German planes were almost absent, and U.S. reconnaissance aircraft freely corrected artillery fire far ahead. Finally, artillery, the god of war, gained formidable power in the hands of the Americans. At first, the U.S. had to rely on French guns, the legendary 75mm field guns, powerful 155mm Schneider howitzers, and others. But in 1918, the first ships loaded with their own heavy guns began to arrive from America. The Americans even converted several large-caliber naval guns into railway transporters. The U.S. Navy's 14-inch, 356mm naval guns, mounted on railway platforms, arrived in France in the fall of 1918 under the command of Captain Charles Pleasanton. These monsters could fire 20-30 kilometers using naval armor-piercing shells. In October 1918, American artillerymen shelled the important German hub of Metz, instilling in the enemy soldiers the idea that now their rear was out of reach of the enemy and no longer safe. American artillerymen quickly learned the skills of their senior allies. By the autumn battles, they had already mastered the technique of the firewall, when the infantry advances in close formation behind a moving artillery barrage. They also learned a complex system of assault artillery preparation, gradually shifting fire from the front line deep into enemy defenses and suppressing enemy artillery with counter-battery fire. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the Americans concentrated up to 2,700 guns, an incredible number that ensured firepower superiority in the breakthrough area. Although the quality of equipment and training was still inferior to that of the seasoned French or British, quantity made up for a lot. Additionally, the American artillerymen had no shortage of energy and courage. They dragged their guns forward across rough terrain almost by hand, crossed rivers on homemade rafts, and immediately opened fire to support the infantry. Trucks delivered shells without interruption. On September 26th alone, the first day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, American artillery fired about 270,000 shells at the Germans. The impact of the Yankees on the course of the war and morale. The entry of the United States into World War I radically changed the psychological climate on the Western Front. With their massive arrival, American troops not only strengthened the material superiority of the Entente, but also gave new hope to their wearied allies and undermined the fighting spirit of the Germans. When the German army launched desperate offensives in the spring of 1918, trying to beat the Yankees to the punch, every German soldier knew that somewhere behind the front lines, new regiments from the U.S. were landing. Every month of delay meant thousands of fresh bayonets in the enemy camp for Germany. After the failures of the summer offensive of 1918, German General Ludendorff gloomily noted that August 8th, when the British and French defeated the Germans at Amiens, was a black day for the German army, marking the beginning of its inevitable decline. In reality, it was the Americans who accelerated the process of demoralization. From the summer of 1918, the Allies once again felt superior in terms of manpower, knowing that they now outnumbered the enemy in both numbers and reserves. French and British soldiers who had survived the hell of Verdun and the Somme saw the Americans as brothers in arms who had come to their aid at the last moment. This morale boost cannot be overestimated. It is no coincidence that thousands of British and French families named their newborn sons Wilson in 1918 to 1919 in honor of the U.S. President as a token of gratitude to America for saving them. For the Germans, however, the moral effect was the opposite. The further they went, the more they became convinced that continuing the fight was hopeless. Here is the testimony of a German soldier captured in 1918. We knew that there were many Americans and that they could not be defeated. They attack without interruption, day and night, and cannot be stopped by artillery. They have nerves of steel. Every day we wait for the end. These words clearly illustrate the despair that gripped the once invincible Kaiser's army. By November 1918, the German command recognized that the situation was hopeless. The army had lost its combat capability, soldiers were surrendering or deserting en masse, and there was a revolution in the rear. American commander General Liggett wrote, "The greatest advantage we had over the Germans was the ability to endlessly replenish our ranks and revive the offensive when they had already exhausted themselves." Thus, the arrival of the Americans became one of the decisive factors that tipped the scales in World War I. They brought fresh forces, new technology, and a naive courage that sometimes bordered on recklessness. But this was exactly what the bloodied armies of Europe lacked. When silence fell over the trenches on November 11, 1918, and soldiers on both sides heard birds singing over the fields, the world realized that the Great War was over. And to a large extent, this was thanks to those same Yankees who, arriving from across the ocean, helped turn a protracted war into a victorious peace. The American blow, a million sons of democracy, as they were called, became the final battering ram that broke down the strong but worn-out gate of the German Empire. The events of 1917 to 1918 showed everyone that the United States was becoming a new world power that would have to be reckoned with in all future conflicts. The First World War was over, and a new power came to the forefront of history, the United States of America. Tempered in the battles of Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, and Meuse-Argonne. Their journey on the fields of Europe was just beginning.